Technically, this week's reading gives the last chapter of the book of Acts before we get into the epistle of Paul to the Romans, but we included chapter 28 in last week's video, and we'll just talk in this video about Romans chapters 1 to 4. So let's say some things about that to prep us for this week's reading. Okay, in Romans in general, in the book of Romans, one of the key ideas that comes up over and over again is that of the gospel. And that word shows up a bunch of times, and in particular, the first paragraph of the book and the last paragraph of the book really address this idea of the gospel, what it is, and what it is intended by God to do. And in short, we want to be clear that the gospel is this. It is the good news. That's what the word means. And what is the good news? The good news is that Jesus is King. I think this is important to identify that the gospel is about Jesus. The good news is about Jesus. Now, of course, it has implications for us. Because Jesus is King, there's a whole host of wonderful, wonderful things that are true for us and that we benefit from. But at its core, the gospel, the good news, is about Him. It's about Jesus, specifically that He is the King. He's the Son of God. He is the Son of David. He is the Messiah that has been promised and that has risen from the dead and through that declared to be the King. And Paul says that he is proclaiming this good news for the purpose of bringing about what he calls in chapter 1, the obedience of faith among the nations. And that shows us a couple things about the book of Romans and about the gospel in general. One is that it requires obedience, and that when you trust in Jesus as King, you are giving your loyalty, you're giving your allegiance to Him, and in that you are obeying the King. But that idea of the obedience of faith for the nations highlights also what is maybe the most critical thing in the book of Romans for Paul, which is that the gospel is for all, as the song says, but the gospel is for Jews and Gentiles. And I would encourage you, as you read Romans, to be looking for this. I think, if you're looking for it, this is the theme that we see all throughout this book and really almost all of the epistles of Paul, that Jesus is King for Jews, Jesus is King for Gentiles, and notice this phrase, how many times it comes up, there is no distinction. And that's really his thesis in chapter 1 when he says that he's not ashamed of this gospel. This gospel will not disappoint him. It will not let him down because it is the power of God to save everybody, Jew and Greek, all those who trust in King Jesus. And that's really what he's going to emphasize all the way throughout, is that Jews do not have a higher place. They do not have a head start. Gentiles are not second-class citizens in the kingdom, and they don't have to jump through extra hoops like circumcision and the Sabbath and so on in order to be in the kingdom. Everybody comes into the kingdom in the same way, which is through the obedience of faith, trusting in King Jesus. And Paul says that that message shows, in fact, the rest of his thesis is that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And especially in these first 4 chapters, I think Paul is emphasizing that the gospel declares God's righteousness. I have to give credit, although I should be giving them more credit than I do, to the Bible Project. When they outlined the book of Romans, that is their section heading for this section, Romans 1 to 4. The gospel declares God's righteousness. And if you have not checked out the Bible Project, they have wonderful content on Bible books and Bible themes. But this is what we see. And in 2 ways, the gospel in this section declares God's righteousness. On one hand, he holds all men, Jew and Gentile, accountable for their sin. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That is really his kind of concluding statement after he has shown in detail that the Gentile world is in sin, that the Jews themselves who have the law and have circumcision, they're also in sin, and that all are guilty before God. And so there is no partiality in the way that God holds all people accountable for their sin. And in justifying all men in Christ, God has done that without partiality. He has not made distinction. And it is the same for Jew and Gentile, as we've said before, that they are saved by trusting in Jesus, not by keeping the customs of the law of Moses. And God shows no partiality. He makes no distinction in that way. And in fact, in chapter 4, when Abraham is brought up and talked about in terms of his justification before God, that is really what Paul is highlighting. That he did this before he was circumcised, showing that it was his trust in God that led to his justification, not the fact that he was circumcised. And so again, the message is that there is no distinction, that all benefit from God's promise to Abraham that those who have faith in Jesus will receive the promised blessing to be heirs of the world, which is what he will then transition to talk more about in the next section, which we'll get to next week. But for now, enjoy the wonderfully rich, sometimes complex, book of Romans, and look out this time next week for the next video. And if you would like to, subscribe to be notified of videos every week as we read the Bible front to back in the year 2020. Thank you so much.